morning, everybody, and welcome to the Diau Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'll be chairing today. So today we have three speakers, and then there's me in Cambridge, and I'll just very briefly introduce them before we start. So Simon Cheng is a Hong Kong pro-democracy activist. He was in the news fairly recently when he was working for the British Consulate General in Hong Kong and went to mainland China to monitor the protests. And he was detained there for over 2 weeks, and of course he'll be talking about that. He has been given asylum by the British government and is now running Haven Assistance, which is an advice platform helping people from Hong Kong who are seeking asylum. Second speaker will be Professor Barry Buzan. He's Emeritus Professor of International Relations at LSE in London, and he's an honorary professor at Copenhagen and Jilin universities. He's published widely on topics relating to security and international relations, particularly, I think it's fair to say, in the Far Eastern region. And then our third speaker will be Professor Arthur Stockwin, and he was formerly the director of the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies at the University of Oxford. He's an emeritus fellow of St. Antony's College there. He also has published widely and is an expert on Japanese politics. And he is the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese government in recognition of his work for Japanese studies in the UK. So this is the timeline. That was my introduction. We'll have three presentations of about 15 minutes each, and we hope to hit the Q&A at around 1:45, and we may run on a little bit later than 1 if it's lively, which I anticipate that it probably will be. So with thanks to our speakers, over to you, Simon Cheng.
Hi, hello. Thanks. So let me show my presentation first. All right, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for Jason's very good introduction. So it should be very brief because it's only lasts for 13 or to 15 minutes. So just keep it brief. And if you want to have more details, I will give you the link, which is my full account of the incident I experienced. So the topics would be fight for democracy and ordeal. So firstly introduce my background. I graduated from the National Taiwan University, studied in major in political science and international relations. I was exchange students in Peking University and also Tokyo University for just a short-term exchange. And then I worked for the European Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan, so represents the businessmen to lobby with the government officials back in Taiwan. And afterwards, I attended the LSE to study political economy. And afterwards, that I worked and served the position as a trade and investment officer at the British Consulate General in Hong Kong. So here, suppose you all know a few years ago, like President Xi Jinping wanted to initiate the one Belt One Road. To be a very assertive economic plan to connect with the world. You can see that deliberately to going west and to connect with the Europe, Africa, and also the Central Asia. So you can see a little bit, delineate from the United States and, like the Pacific region. And as a background, you can see that they wanted to integrate not only about the world, it's also about the Hong Kong with mainland China. So you can see they wanted to constitute a Greater Bay Area, cover several major cities, and including in Hong Kong. So you can see economically, you can see Hong Kong is more and more mainlandized, I would say, internalized to be one of the engines to boost the economy within the Greater Bay Area. So based on this kind of background, I after 2019, I have more chances to frequently travel back to Shenzhen and Guangzhou as a part of the Greater Bay Area scheme. Especially, I advocate for the trade and investment in terms of the AI technology. So Shenzhen would be China's Silicon Valley. So I need to get back to Shenzhen frequently to seek the opportunities to do the business. But meanwhile, in 2019, they have historically challenging to Hong Kong, because that's a lot of the political struggling and unrest. You can see the people they peacefully have a rally, and then they're gonna be more aggressive and assertive, the tactics to achieve for more rights of political rights for democracy. And you can see that they have more suppressions from the police, and there has a lot of divisive opinions in Hong Kong. Some people, they say they're patriotic to China, but some people feel Hong Kong is falling, dying. And you can see when I was still on a business trip to Shenzhen during the very turbulent period, and I actually was in Shenzhen for business trip, you can see the Futian, actually I took the high-speed train from Futian to West Kowloon terminus. So you can see actually it's actually in the downtown of Hong Kong. It's very, very in the center of Hong Kong. So here's my took the picture years ago, and you can see that it's a high-speed railway station, and you can see that's actually in downtown. And here you can see that's because that they built the high-speed railway station, so they carve out the specific land to mainland China. So that's a Chinese law enforcement, police can execute their mainland Chinese law within the downtown of Hong Kong. But jurisdictionally, based in terms of jurisdiction, is part of China. So you can see that as a mainland China port. They set this for better convenience for those people to commute. So you can see if from Shenzhen back to Hong Kong, I would be, on B4 level. And then I need to get upstairs to B2 to make the mainland departure clearance. So actually, when I've arrived in B2, I need to insert my ID card, and then I've been stuck in between. And then I realized I've been stopped. So the people, they checked, and then they realized something unusual happened, and then they start to wear the tiny camera on their shoulders. I know something bad's happened. So when I'm just stuck in between, I start to delete or try my best to start to delete my messages, which has, lots of the sensitive message, which is critical comments about the government, because I know during the turbulent period, they would check your mobile phone, etc., to see whether you're a protester. And then I've been put back to this kind of the police station. Is so, to me, as so appalling, because it's in West Kowloon, but that is mainland Chinese police station. You can see that has a plainclothes officer and also those people wearing uniform in downtown of Hong Kong, And then when I've been held for several hours, they asked me to get my passcode of the phone, because I was on a business trip that is work phone. So I reject to give them the passcode because they have some sensitive conversation with the consulate officials. So I reject it. And then they delivered me back to Shenzhen. I remember that is in Lianhua police station. And why I would just take this picture, because it's from Pambai, the mainland Chinese media, and saying in April 2020, they have some very mysterious fire happen. So I'm not sure, because lots of documents there. So maybe they're burned, I'm not sure. So I just want to briefly introduce or finally realize that those police, they either would work for the domestic security or state security. Domestic security, actually, they have been part of the Ministry of the Public Security, and they have one department which is specifically tackles the political dissident. So if you leave any criminal comments on the internet, or they feel you're challenging the authority, this kind of the domestic security bureau would interrogate you and would detain you. to check whether why you would be disloyal to the government and the party. And the state security, usually they would tackle some external oriented incident. For example, they would send agent outside, or maybe they would just check whether there have been spy operating in mainland China, and then they would check. And now, not only in mainland China, they have a legalized status in Hong Kong after national security law. So when I've been put back to Linhua police station, I've been put into the cell and put on the tiger chair. So you can see it's just like this, and then buckle up, and you cannot move. It is something that would be like this, you know, like the tiger chair. This is quite usual chairs for interrogation in mainland China. So I've been put into the tiny cell, and then I've been put on the tiger chair. And without any reason, they gave me no reason. And afterwards, and they asked me a series of questions, political questions. They asked, what do you feel about Hong Kong? Why would you join the protest? And what's the role of the UK behind the protest? Why I would need to instigate the protest? They thought I'm a mastermind of the protest, and who I should tell them who engage in the protest, including those peaceful and legal rally. And when I finished the first interrogation, they put me into the custody like this. So I've been, you know, been here to waiting for the result. So, and afterwards, that they transferred me to another police station, and they try to extend the detention period, and they claim, based on external sources, I solicit prostitution when I visit the massage parlor. But I would say that's because you know, like at that time, they have no jewels and transparent trial for me, and then they hint me if I'm not cooperative, and then they will hand me back to those plainclothes officer, which is apparently working for the state security. So I will face a harder charge, and even I've been put into the criminal detention, not just administrative detention. So I got this cover decision paper to say I detain, but they leave it blank. I mean, you can see that they write something on it, but at that time when I just give the fingerprints, they leave it blank from when to when I will be detained. So they can actually decide when I'll be detained. And when I just do lots of the body checks, and for example, the uric blood test to get my DNA and all biometric information, and I've been thrown into this local detention center. So it will be like this. It's similar to be like this, the cell. And the first day that I can mingle with about 15 inmates, but after the second days, and then I've been put into solitary confinement without any reason at all. And during the whole period of detention, I've been asked out for the interrogation. Sometimes it'll be like this, and then they'll keep asking me about my political loyalty, whether I'm loyal to the party or the other countries. And you know, like after a few days, they use a violent way to access my phone, and then to apply to ask me out of the detention center for further interrogation. I think that is those people that are working for the state security. So I've been handcuffed, I've been shackled, I've been blindfolded, and I've been hooded. Totally hooded, blindfolded. I can't see anything. And then they put me on a private white van, and then to deliver me to a secret place. I can't see anything, and it seems like the facilities for a very serious interrogation with torture. So I've been hung up like this, and it seems like I would need to do lots of extreme, they said, let's say, exercise. I need to do squats. I need to be stand still, cannot move a bit. They deprive my sleep. And if I just feel shuffled, and I've been bitten using a known weapon, I'm not sure what that is. It's like a baton, sharpened baton. And I cannot speak. Every time I speak, I need to get allowance. And then they say, report to my master in Mandarin. And only that time they would allow me to speak. And if I just, you know, move a bit, and I've been punished to sing the Chinese anthem, to learn how to be patriotic. They said that can wake me up. It means wake me up to be loyal to the country. So, and afterwards, let's say print the conversation and the email from me to the consular officials, and then they get some documents, which is the division of the labor, to assign some different tasks for those consular workers to monitor or to get updates of the protest. But actually, we're observing the protest. That is for the travel alerts, but they printed out as evidence. And also they gave me a piles of the photos to identify who and who are protesters. And they asked me to draft the organizational chart to see that is some organization to instigate protests as well. And also afterwards, they enforced to do the confession and make the confession videotapes like many others, because that they use a different decision paper. One is for 15 days to be released as proposed. One is for detained for 2 more years under the re-education through the sheltering. So they have 2 different decision paper to threaten me to speak in the way they like. For example, I say, I know torture, they treat me very well, etc., etc. So that is a false conviction. I've been tortured. So why I've been, used soliciting prostitution as an excuse? Because that is the administrative detention. You can't access lawyer at all. You can't access the court. You can't have a due process of the trial court at all. And of course, you're not allowed to communicate with your own family members. And also, as administrative detention, they need not to notify the Hong Kong authorities what's actually happening at that time. So there has a lot of similar cases in mainland China. You can see the human rights lawyer Wang Cheng. He also said to the Japanese media saying he had been ordered to stand still for continuously 15 hours, and he had been tortured as well. And you can see Taiwanese Li Mengju, he has been still criminally detained by the state security, and just because he took a picture in a public occasion in Shenzhen. And also Grammy Wang, he waved the Union Jack during the protest back in Hong Kong, but he had been disappeared for 1 year. And then she had been administratively detained for 15 days, and afterwards had been criminally detained for about a month. And she was enforced to do the patriotic trip to Shanxi province to learn how to be patriotic to China. So he also had been under surveillance by the state security when she was in mainland China. Now she was back to Hong Kong, and she held the press conference to expose what she experienced. So you can see, no matter Grandma Wang and Li Mengju from Taiwan, they've all been disappeared in August last year. And you can see afterwards, when I've been released and I fled from Hong Kong to Taiwan, I spoke out, and then a lot of retaliation, including this. That is the further stigmatization. CGTN is a CCTV, the Chinese top-tier state media overseas branch. And the European headquarters is located exactly in London. You can see the YouTube, the title is Simon Cheng, shame on you. So I fly the complaint to the Ofcom to say they're biased, because they gave a morally judgment on me. Absolutely, that has been enforced to confess. And also, let alone more others, state media and also external propaganda news. Global Times, People's Daily, they're officially state media. But Doorway News, dwnews.com, they actually is, it seems like a civilian media, but actually they have been, pro-Beijing, and have been externally aimed to those Chinese overseas communities. So that is a Chinese news. And you can see Ambassador Liu Xiaoming also saying that there is no torture, but obviously that is a lie. But I'm just appalling. I would say, the new UK ambassador in Beijing just hold the Bible of the Xi Jinping. I'm not sure why she would need to do it. A little bit upset about it, to be honest. And when I was in Hong Kong, when I flagged back to Hong Kong, the secret agents still follow me. You can see that those people that are in Hong Kong, and those people in Taiwan, and those people in central London. So they all have lots of the Chinese suspected agents around here. And then afterwards, when I just keep speaking out, and the Hong Kong new established state security department put me on a wanted list to say I have been suspected to endanger the state security. But actually they got, my enforced confessional videotape to say I made treason. I betrayed my own motherland. And of course that I received a threatening letter. I'm not sure whether it's truly CY Leung, but the sender name is CY Leung, to say Chinese agents will find me and bring me back, and it's just only a matter of time. So, and at that time I'm in the UK. So, but still, no matter how I've been, mistreated and what threats I've been facing, I'm still continues the efforts to achieve the full democracy for my hometown, not only in Hong Kong, but hopefully in China, because I love Chinese people. I think that is my hometown as well. But the stage one, I need to rescue my fellow men. So I set up the Haven Assistance with other activists and exiles to provide the open and public and legal information of the asylum policy amongst different major democratic allies, including UK, my part, Germany, United States, Taiwan, Australia, and Canada. So now we successfully get about 115 cases in the UK, but more inquiries will come. I would receive 10 to 15 inquiries per day. And the second one would be solidifying, because we can expect about 200,000 people will come to the UK from Hong Kong due to the BNO status have been changed. So we set up the Hong Kongers expat community in here, like Hong Kongers in Britain. We register in the company house, and because we need to solidify those people and need not to forget those people, why it can be eligible to come to UK, because those elements, they make sacrifice for the pro-democracy movement last year. And the third one, the final one, I feel once you have more vibrant and rich Hong Kongers expat community, I think that is about the time to empower those people, not only those people in Hong Kong, but outside of Hong Kong. Provided you are Hong Kong people, and then you have been empowered to vote for the true democracy. So these kind of things will be the civic groups, and I would feel the democratic mechanism would be commonly operate in, usually in human society. No matter you set up the civic groups or the companies, and then your stakeholders will have a vote to vote for your board of director. So we just following the same logic that as a civic groups, it's not parliament exile, it's not government exile, it's just a non-official civic groups, which is reflecting the voice of the Hong Kong people. We enfranchise all the Hong Kong people, no matter inside or outside of Hong Kong, have a vote to vote for their delegate, which is a member of the board of the director, to speak, to have a debate. So that's it, and that is the shadow parliament. We wanted to claim that is a democratic legitimacy. That's legitimacy to say that you use the most civilized and peaceful way to say, actually, Hong Kong people, they're well prepared and well enough to experience what is a true and full democracy. It's not the democracy have been curtailed, have been divided arbitrarily by Beijing, by the Chinese CCP authorities. So I wanted to emphasize is that we're not anti-China. We love China, we care about those people's rights back in China, including Hong Kong. And I would feel we need to respect the voice of those people. And that's it, is because we're patriotic enough. So we try our best, even we face a greater risk to achieve more political rights for those people.
Simon,
so
thank you.
Fight for democracy continues. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing your very harrowing experiences with us. Very bravely, I may say. And so let's go on to Professor Barry Buzan, who will put this in a bit of broader context. I mean, obviously, China has started throwing its weight around more noticeably not just in regard to Hong Kong, but on a number of other issues as well. What does this all mean for the broader global context?
Okay, thank you, Jason, and thank you for inviting me to this. As you say, yes, this is going to move from the very personal story that Simon has set out to a rather global, high-altitude view of all of this. So my starting position to kind of set the context for this is to ask how Hong Kong fits into the wider global picture. And broadly speaking, I see that picture as being one in which we are moving, we collectively, international society, are moving towards a post-Western world order. That means that wealth and power and cultural authority are all becoming much more diffuse than they have been over the last couple of 100 years. So it's a turbulent, very interesting transition, which is going to be going on for some decades. That's what we're in the middle of. That I'm fairly confident about. I'm going to stick my neck out for this occasion and say that if we were to play the game of moving our minds 20 or 30 years ahead and looking back at this time, what would we make of 2020 and the particular position of Hong Kong in this broader transition? And I'm going to argue that Hong Kong might well be the symbolic event that is used to mark the beginning or the opening of a new Cold War between China and the West. And so that's the thrust of my argument. I'll begin by looking at China and the US in this. Now, normally when talking about China and the US, there's a lot of emphasis on how different they are, different levels of development. China is the rising power, the US is the declining power, etc. But more interesting for these purposes is how similar they are. And I think this matters a lot in thinking about how Hong Kong plays into this development. Both China and the US are privileging domestic politics over foreign policy almost completely. They both have radical leaderships that are pursuing big domestic reforms. In both cases, they are seeking greater economic self-reliance, and in both cases, they are seeking to concentrate more power in the executive. Their current leaderships care little about international reactions to their behavior. Trump doesn't care what other people think about what he's doing, and my sense is that Xi Jinping doesn't either. Not only that, but these leaderships are happy to stoke a considerable degree of international tension in order to support their domestic politics. This is a very old trick in international relations. I do not think that either country or either leadership wants war, quite the contrary, but they do want a more tense international environment, because that traditionally then enables you to focus on domestic security and justify increasing degrees of government control over the domestic sphere. Both of these countries also have what, in my view, are almost completely incoherent foreign policies about which they don't seem to care. Right? I mean, the Trump policy, making America great again, is trying to make America great again by undermining all of its alliances and the institutions that the US built, undermining much of the trust and goodwill on which the whole position of the United States as the last superpower since the end of the Cold War has been based. This is a completely incoherent position, right? Because American power rests as much on its social position in international society as it does on the undoubted material power of the country. China, for its part, seems to have acute difficulty lining up its rhetoric and its practice in foreign policy. So there's a lot of rhetoric about harmony, about peaceful rise, development, about win-win relations, about sovereign equality and non-intervention. But then there's a very consistent assertion of a bid, if you will, for regional primacy, a lot of bullying in Southeast Asia and South Asia and against Japan. So these are countries that really don't care what the rest of the world thinks, and which arguably are quite interested in having a more tense international environment. Now, Hong Kong, I think, fits very nicely into this, right? Because it's not a dangerous issue for either of them, right? There's no question but that China owns Hong Kong. So that's not a kind of issue. It's less of an issue than it would be with Taiwan. So because Hong Kong is accepted as part of China, there's very low risk that anybody's going to go to war over this. But there's all kinds of opportunities for both China and the US in this. China in particular can use its policy in Hong Kong to show its strength and to show its ruthlessness, both of which the present regime seem quite keen to advertise. Right? So by being tough in Hong Kong, China can impress its domestic nationalists, which is always a big point of sensitivity for the leadership of the Communist Party. They do not want to be outflanked from the nationalist right. It gives China an excuse to increase its self-reliance, because it can say the rest of the world is ganging up on us and being critical of us, etc., etc. It provides opportunities for China to back up the plausibility of its claims in the rest of East Asia. Not so much that the claims are in and of themselves plausible, but that China is prepared not to care about international reactions in how it pursues these things. So it's a good opportunity for China generally to declare that it's no longer afraid of the US and will go ahead and do what it thinks it needs to do, regardless of what anybody else thinks. For the US, the big opportunity in Hong Kong is to demonstrate that China is a threat to democracy and that it can't be trusted. Okay? So the US can use its large array of economic tools and pressures against China, which it is doing. This is a line that in American domestic politics, particularly at this fraught electoral moment, plays very well, because almost the only thing that Americans seem to be able to agree on is that they think that China is a problem and a threat. And importantly also, despite all that Trump has done to alienate America's traditional allies, this is an issue that brings those allies closer to the American view of China. So India, Britain, Australia, Germany, and the EU have all substantially shifted their positions on how they see China as a result of Hong Kong. I think the kind of threat to democracy issue was something that provided a kind of tipping point. So up until the events in Hong Kong, most of the Europeans and Australia, and India and others were all more or less prepared to try to get along with China, being cautious about it, obviously, but not treating China as an enemy or as a threat. But the Hong Kong events seem to have tipped opinion amongst the leaderships in much of Europe, much of the Anglosphere, and India, which has its own reasons for worrying about China, into now thinking about China as a threat, to taking active measures to restrict China's economic access, the whole Huawei issue, restrictions on China's takeovers, and then just seeing China as aggressive and threatening. In other words, Hong Kong has shifted opinion amongst America's allies more in line with the American view that China should be seen as threatening, which simply wasn't the case before that. And in Britain's case, it's remarkable that it's done this. I mean, here we have a conservative government that is pretty xenophobic and anti-immigration, but has offered 3 million Hong Kongers residence in Britain if they wanted, in the process putting at risk a trade deal with China, which they are absolutely desperate to have. That's quite a big and substantial shift given the relatively cowardly position that the UK government has taken. And one could say the same things about the shifts in Canada and Australia and elsewhere. I'll leave Arthur to talk about Japan. I think that I'd be interested to see what Simon has to say about this comment. I think perhaps in considering what was going on in the minds of the activists in Hong Kong, I'd be surprised if very many of those activists thought that they could actually stop China from taking over Hong Kong. My understanding of the game was that the best they could do was to make it pay a high price for doing that. And in this, I think they succeeded. It remains to be seen how many Hong Kongers will leave or stay, and what the corporations will do, whether they will leave or stay. But China is paying a very high price for this. So to sum up, I think my first conclusion was that China has inflicted yet another considerable diplomatic defeat on itself by doing this. Although that said, I rather strongly suspect that most Chinese will not see it that way. Probably the Chinese government is quite satisfied with what it has done, and thinks that it has, in a sense, strengthened its hand. So China here competes with Trump in its indifference to building trust and being concerned about its international social capital. I think it is a kind of victory for the Hong Kong activists that they've made China pay a high price, but I'm not quite sure that this is a victory that anybody would want to celebrate. I mean, I can understand why they wanted to do that, but it's not a happy outcome really for anybody. So we will have to wait. Jason, you will have to invite me back in 2030 or so to see whether this prediction holds up or not. So we have to wait and see, but it does feel to me very much like a new Cold War emerged in 2020, and that the tipping point was what happened in Hong Kong and the way the rest of the Western world reacted to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Barry. Well, obviously one of the features of the Cold War was that the world kind of divided into two zones, and we're trying to avoid doing that as far as possible. But Japan is in a particularly awkward position, being right next to China. So maybe Arthur can talk us through how the Japanese are going to respond to this.
Thank you very much. I've got a script, but I'm going to race through it pretty much because of the time constraints. First of all, Japan and the UK are both parliamentary democracies, but in relation to Hong Kong, they're in rather different situations. The UK is the former colonial power. Japan has no such historical link apart from wartime occupation. In Japan, you'd be unlikely to find a leading public figure speaking forcefully today in the style of Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, of the, quote, totalitarian Xi Jinping regime and its trampling on human rights, close quotes. Now, before I speak specifically about Hong Kong, I want to discuss briefly key developments of recent years in Japan-China relations. Japan and China re-established diplomatic relations in 1972, signed a trade treaty in 1978, and this led to rapidly increasing trade, fast-growing Japanese economy, substantial economic growth also in China. And then 1989, Tiananmen massacre perpetrated by the Deng Xiaoping government, fearful of losing its monopolistic control. Japan followed other major companies in imposing sanctions on China, but did so reluctantly and lifted the sanctions quickly. And then there was the Senkaku or Diau island dispute between China and Japan, and for a while this seemed a very dangerous situation, but there has been an incident in the middle of this month of October, which seems to have revived it, but there was a kind of tacit agreement to calm down the issue, but it hasn't gone away. Now, the Xi Jinping regime in China was inaugurated in 2012, and I think this has led to a much more centralized and harsher interpretation of socialism than what had previously prevailed. Same year, 2012, Abe Shinzo became Prime Minister of Japan. He remained in post until September this year as the longest continually serving Prime Minister in Japanese political history. And then in 2016, Trump became President of the United States. Now, this is important. Abe exerted himself to establish good relations with Trump as an insurance policy, thus putting Japan in a position highly critical of the Chinese regime. And the Japan-US Mutual Security Treaty remained the basis of Japanese defense policy. But that doesn't mean, I think, that the Abe regime was simply blindly following Trump on foreign policy and defense policy. Over this period, Japan-China relations were deeply affected by the war apology issue in relation mainly to China, and that of official prime ministerial pilgrimages to the Yasukuni Shrine to the war dead, much resented by China. Unlike Abe's predecessor Koizumi a decade earlier, Abe only visited the Yasukuni Shrine once in 2013 in his official capacity, attracting obviously a hostile reaction from China. But after he stepped down a month ago, one of his first acts was to visit the Yasukuni Shrine as a private citizen. He also made a heavily qualified war apology in August 2015. I now want to turn specifically to Hong Kong as well as to the new Japanese government of Mr. Suga Yoshihide. If I may, I will set this out as a series of numbered points. Number one, Hong Kong society today, as I understand it, and I'm not a specialist on Hong Kong, combines Chinese culture with values of democracy, human rights, and personal freedom going back to the 19th century. So that the culture of Hong Kong, and this is, I think, very important, is far from being a carbon copy of the culture of the People's Republic of China. Point two, as the Japanese economy grew rapidly in the 1980s, the Japanese population in Hong Kong increased rapidly, but then it declined after reversion in 1997 as businesses, foreign businesses and Japanese businesses moved to Shenzhen and Guangzhou and elsewhere. But numbers have come back again so that there are comparable numbers of Japanese residents in Hong Kong, I understand, as in London or New York, for instance. Point number three. In June 2020, the Chinese government imposed its own security law on Hong Kong in the face of widespread protests. And Mr. Suga, present Prime Minister of Japan of the last month, who was then Chief Cabinet Secretary in the Abe government, said, and I quote, "This is regrettable, undermining the one country, two systems." But I mean, he didn't, this I think is a fairly minimal statement by Suga, and he wasn't really pushing this, nor was Mr. Abe too much at that time, perhaps. Now, Abe, this is point four, was the longest continuously serving prime minister in Japanese political history, but in the end, his regime had petered out rather amidst many accusations of government corruption. Now, number five, let's look at Suga, because he is the present prime minister, and he was generally seen during the Abe government, which lasted from 2012 to 2020, as without political ambitions of his own, and therefore unlikely, it was believed, and I've seen many statements to this effect, that he would become the successor as prime minister to Mr. Abe. But once the opportunity presented himself, and this must have happened many times before in history, he took it apparently with enthusiasm. But he'd always been a domestic policy specialist, inexperienced in foreign affairs, unlike the globe-trotting prime minister who'd been to many, many countries during his prime ministership. Suga also seemed to lack Abe's nostalgia for aspects of the pre-war regime and its Meiji constitution, and his hostility to the post-war constitution. In a very pithy phrase, the magazine Diplomat suggested that the Suga regime would be Abenomics without Yasukuni. Suga's priorities have been indicated by his expressed desire, which has nothing to do with Hong Kong, to put it mildly, to digitize his government bureaucracy, stopping bureaucrats from communicating by fax or affixing Hanko seals onto documents, as apparently they still do to a large extent. Point number six, Suga, though, is now shown to be personally ambitious and may branch out on his own in policy areas, including foreign policy. Much, of course, depends on actions by China. But if China now puts serious pressures on Taiwan, where Japan retains strong ties from colonial times, and incidentally, Taiwan and Japan are generally on pretty good terms, as well as onto Hong Kong, the pressure of events may force Suga's government to react decisively, whether he is a foreign policy specialist or not. Point number 7, a final key variable will be the results of the US presidential election next month. Will the United States be headed by Trump or Biden from 2021? Both would succeed to contain China, but Biden probably in a more sober and considered way than Trump. This will also affect Japanese policy towards China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the two Koreas, and even Eastern Siberia, since all these issues are closely interrelated. East Asia is a closely interacting region. Now, my final point before conclusion is this. There is an alternative view within the Liberal Democratic Party, led by the long-serving Secretary General of the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, Mr. Nikai Toshimitsu, who lobbies for closer and more intense relations with China. But the balance of power within the LDP suggests that a shift away from the United States towards China is pretty much unlikely. It is worth noting perhaps that LDP governments have generally sided with Republican administrations in the US, so that if Biden wins the US presidential election shortly, the pro-American orthodoxy within the LDP might be somewhat weakened. But I certainly do not see the Nikai tendency prevailing in the short to medium term. Therefore, in conclusion, I would say that the Suga regime, which has only a year to run to the end of what would have been Abe's final term, though Suga may be re-elected, re-chosen as Prime Minister next year, nevertheless, he is, on the face of it, a short-term Prime Minister. And secondly, and finally, Japan's policy regarding Hong Kong is likely to depend above all else upon the future actions of China, and we don't know exactly what those are going to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to all three of our speakers for giving us completely different perspectives on this one issue. But for today, let's end it there. Thank you all very much.